Hello, I'm Nicola Curtin, again, the program evaluator here at the Center of Excellence. And this lecture is our quick guide to really designing and running focus groups. So hopefully this will be useful to you if you decide you'd like to undertake some focus groups in running your evaluations. And so we have the overview of program evaluation lecture, and this then is just looking more closely at focus groups. So after this lecture, you should understand what the purpose of a focus group study is, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages to it, and what are some of the steps involved in running or conducting a focus group study. So a focus group, actually the name really says it all. It's a group-based discussion and it focuses in a sort of targeted way on a particular issue that's of interest to you, the evaluator. Usually consists of about 6 to 12 people. You can run smaller focus groups if you need to or want to. There needs to be some way in which they are similar to each other. So oftentimes, of course, it's people who are either benefiting from a service your program's providing or people who are running your programs. And what you want to do is you're guiding them through a facilitated, and I underline that because it's quite important, and we'll talk about what that means. A discussion on a very clearly defined topic. So, and of course, as the facilitator, you're going to guide them through that conversation. And then you take that information, or what I would call data, right? And you want to use it to understand their perspective on a really particular topic or an issue or an experience, right? And of course, in this case, you're using it to understand your program in some way. Focus groups can be useful at a number of different stages of program development. It can actually help you plan or develop your program, or you can run focus groups to actually do a needs assessment and see what do people in this community really need? What do they want? What are some of the gaps in service or areas of improvement in health? How can I support the implementation of my program or process? So it can ask some questions about, you could do focus groups with people who are experts in the area. What are the best ways to create a program that's of interest here? It can also help you identify challenges or problems, also successes with a program or a process that you have in place, right? So it sort of tells you about people's experience with something. Sorry, just making sure I'm recording there. So this is also actually in my other lecture, but I talk about what are some of the advantages. A focus group lets you really deep dive, assuming, of course, you really can't ask a lot of questions in a focus group. It's usually 60 to 90 minutes, and 90 is quite long, really. But it does allow you to go real in-depth. You can get a lot of data from multiple people. You can collect a lot of information in a relatively short period of time. And you can really explore and identify maybe common or actually also uncommon concerns or issues, right? So looking at agreement within the group, if something comes up, do many people say, oh yeah, that's an issue? Do other people say, that's actually not a problem for me? It kind of helps you get a sense of like how a community is feeling about something. You need a very well-trained group facilitator in order to develop effective questions, and I'll talk a little bit about that here. And you also need somebody who's pretty good at balancing and thinking about group dynamics. It can be logistically tricky to schedule multiple people, and your interviewer or the other participants can actually bias responses, right? So based on who they are or their responses to things. It can also be difficult and time-consuming to analyze and compare responses. So there's some questions you want to ask yourself when you're planning a focus group or considering it. And the first, of course, is the information it's going to give you most suited to your evaluation question, right? So you sort of think about it, is this an instance where taking a deep dive, having multiple perspectives and interactions of individuals, is that information going to be most useful to you? So for example, if you're talking about a particularly sensitive topic, maybe you're developing a program to address the needs of sexual assault survivors. It may be, of course, that a focus group with survivors would be quite effective in getting kind of broad perspective, but it may be that you feel like some of the questions are so sensitive that the kinds of information you need, for example, will be better in a one-on-one interview, let's say. So you really want to think about, or for example, maybe you decide, really, I just want to know how many people have been using my service, or, have been have sort of attended, let's say, my drop-in center. Well, a focus group isn't going to be then, you just want to do a survey or look at attendance records. So you just want to think about, what kind of information are you getting here? And is it really going to, be well suited to your evaluation question? It's very important that your potential focus group members are at least somewhat comfortable with each other. And you really want to think about if they're not using an alternative data collection method. And I talked about this a little bit in the overview of evaluation methods, right? That you really want to think about power and status when you're designing these studies, right? So in every organization, almost every organization, there's some kind of hierarchy, and you really want to think about, who's going to be in the group, and are these people going to be, is everybody going to be comfortable sharing? And how can I create a group where I'm going to get people to sort of be the most honest and share the most with me? So, are the potential, I use this term experts here, and really, I don't mean that they have to know everything about your program, but, if you're interested in designing a program for sexual assault survivors, you're not going to be, interviewing people who are elementary school teachers. Obviously, that's kind of a ridiculous example, but you just really want to figure out, are these the right people to be asking, right? So, if you want to know how clients perceive your services, you want to talk to your clients, not, for example, your clinicians. Now, you might want to talk to your clinicians if you can't access your clients, but you just want to think about these kinds of things. And you also want to ask yourself a question. I think this is actually quite important in community groups. Are you going to create an expectation that you're regularly going to run such groups? People sometimes love focus groups, right? What they love, of course, is the group interaction piece of it. And you just want to be very realistic with yourself that if you were to create this expectation that you're regularly collecting feedback in this manner, or that you're regularly holding or hosting groups, but you can't do that, you might want to really reconsider if running a focus group is the best thing for your group or your community. So we're going to go through sort of 5 steps. And it shouldn't actually say planning. It's really planning and running a focus group, right? So the first step, of course, is planning the group. You want to develop some questions. And we'll talk a little bit about what that should look like. You want to select and potentially train a facilitator, picking members for the group. So sort of talked a little bit about that. And then, of course, finding an appropriate space. You want to recruit group members then, right? Once you've sort of figured out where you want to recruit them or from what group. You want to facilitate and moderate the group. We'll talk a little bit about what that should look like. You want to analyze and understand the information that you collect from these focus groups. And then, of course, you always want to report out. So when you're planning the group, when you're designing the questions, there are some very important things to sort of understand. And I'll talk about this too in the survey lecture. You want to always remember what you are doing as an evaluator when you're creating an interaction, right? You're communicating with your, in this case, focus group members. And the most effective forms of communication are clear. They're jargon-free, right? You're not going to use a lot of the terminology that you might use, let's say, behind the scenes, or if you have a long or detailed question, you want to make it briefer, or you just want to break it down into shorter questions. So you really want to be ruthless with yourself here. Look at your questions. They should not be super long. They should not have multiple points. It's not that you can't address multiple points. It's just then you need to break it down into smaller questions. And you really want to have it timed correctly. You want to make sure that there's enough time to ask what you want to know. So that means you really have to think about how long is it going to take, given the size of your group, to address each of the questions. And this also means always you're going to be cutting questions. It's almost inevitable. There's sort of two ways to think about how you're going to run the group. One is that you just create a topic guide. It's kind of less structured. You essentially list the topics or the issues that you want to have covered in the group. And you don't necessarily have specific questions. You might have some examples of questions, but you just are going to move through the topics. A question schedule is a bit more structured, and it's not like you can't kind of mix these two methods a little bit. But in a question schedule, you actually have a sequence of exact questions. You've written them out. You really do want to write out your questions, even if you're sort of doing a topic guide, even if you decide you're going to do something a little bit less structured. For each of your topics, you probably want to have some suggested questions, because it can be hard to formulate questions on the fly. You want to get feedback on these questions or the topics from experts in the area of interest. So talk to your colleagues, talk to other patients who won't be in the focus group, pilot things if you can. And if this is your first time being a facilitator, really consider running a practice or a pilot group. It doesn't even necessarily have to be with the targeted people that would be in the kind of group you want to run, but you just want to get adept at running groups. I'm going to talk about, there are kind of different kinds of questions. You don't have to have all of these kinds of questions in your focus group, but it lets you kind of, I think this is helpful for sort of thinking about what's the flow of a group look like. You know, the first thing, of course, you're going to do is you want to warm people up, right? You want to make them feel comfortable. So these are where you ask pretty uncontroversial questions that there's not going to be a lot of strong feelings or disagreement about, right? So just even having everybody go around and show their name, you know, what year they are in college, or how long they've been in the program, where they're from. Again, assuming that these wouldn't be kind of controversial topics, and this all depends on your context. Then you want to have some introductory questions. You're going to sort of start approaching the topic on hand, right? You do not want to spend a lot of time talking about things that don't matter to you. It's a waste of everyone's time. But maybe asking people how they first became involved in the program. And then you want some sort of what we call transitioning questions. You're sort of, you know, you're providing a link between these kind of introductory questions that introduce the topic and your key questions. And your key questions, there should be the most of these, because these are the things you really want to know about. But, you know, like ask people, okay, well, think back to your first time attending a class or your first program session. What were your first impressions? And then you want to get at the things that are of specific interest to you. You want to spend the most time on them. I'm giving you example questions here. These are, of course, not the questions that will make sense for you necessarily. You always want to create some kind of closure. And so I think a nice ending question is basically just ask them if there's anything that they should know. You know, when I do interviews or focus groups, the way I phrase this is I actually say, you know, is there anything you thought we'd be talking about today that we haven't talked about yet, or that you think is important for me to know? And I think that can be a helpful way of getting people to sort of tell you things maybe that might be important to them. So recruitment, which probably seems like it would be relatively straightforward, and it is, but you really want to think about a few issues as you're creating your focus groups. And the first is you have to understand the community that you're recruiting from. You really, really have to understand that community. And if you don't, you need to bring on board somebody who does, who can help you sort of think about these things, right? So who can help you understand that there might be particular group dynamics. There might be a history between people in the organization that would be important to know about. Because again, you know, if you have one person in the group who, you know, is, let's say, everybody else's supervisor, well, everyone else may not be comfortable sharing things that you need to know about, you know, challenges or things that aren't working well, for example. So you really want to pay attention to status and power. And there's just no one right answer for this, right? It's really going to depend on your context. There are all kinds of conversations about, you know, is it better to have people of one gender all in the same group, right? So have a gender homogenous or heterogeneous group. And I think, again, you're just going to have to think through some of the issues. I don't think there is a right or wrong answer. The same with issues related to race or ethnicity or class, these kinds of social categories that, of course, have meaning in terms of how people interact. There are some cultural contexts where it's not appropriate for people of mixed gender to sort of interact, or for example, that there is a strong age hierarchy. So you really, really want to know your community. All Are there some people that you just know, I'm a talker, so I'm going to talk a lot if I'm in your group. And how are you going to balance that? You probably don't want a group of all talkers, right? But you don't want somebody, or if you know you're going to have somebody in the group that's a super talker, you need to be prepared to sort of, help that person take a step back. You want to remember, this is sort of goes back to this question of ethics. You really want to, as you're recruiting, inform people about what you're going to be doing. You want to let them know if you're recording, if you are. You want to let them know how their data will be used. If it's appropriate, you might want to consider getting kind of official consent, having them sign a consent form. You can really draw on your personal relationships to ensure that people sign up and attend. And I just want to say, you can never plan the perfect group. Do not make yourself crazy thinking about these issues that I've highlighted, but don't go in without thinking about them, right? Like the whole point of being an evaluator, I think, is to really just plan ahead and do the best you can with your resources and with what you have. And then, if you notice in a group, wow, there's some interesting dynamics playing out, you just want to pay attention to them, both as you're actively facilitating the group and then while you're analyzing the data. And this probably just sounds so obvious, but remember to send reminders to people about the group before the group. That can really help your attendance. So it's such an art form in some ways, moderating or facilitating a group, and everybody has a different style, and you just have to sort of know what your style is going to be. But there are, I think, some really key things to pay attention to. And again, different people kind of manifest that in different ways. But, just as you pay attention to the composition of the group, you really want to think about who's the moderator, right? So again, if you are, let's say you're interested in the implementation of a program and you want to talk to the clinicians, you might not want to make the head clinician the moderator, because again, people might not feel safe or comfortable sharing challenges in that context. So you really want to think about, okay, what kinds of things do I want to know? And what moderator is going to be kind of the most neutral in getting at that information? You want to pick somebody or become somebody who's comfortable with silences, right? So sort of giving some space for people to talk, and also with being redirective when necessary, right? So you just simply don't have time for people to be going on long tangents, and you have to be comfortable sort of bringing them back. You want to show that you're interested in the group and what they have to say. You really want to think about what your nonverbal what your body language is saying, all your nonverbal cues. Scan the group occasionally, make eye contact. And this is kind of an important one. You might want to consider getting a note taker, because you do not want to be so busy taking notes that you don't seem engaged, right? Or that you aren't looking at people, or that you're not paying attention to the group. And just know yourself. What are your strengths and challenges as a moderator, and how can you plan appropriately for that? Please be ready to hear things you might not like, right? I mean, I sort of talked about this in my other lecture, but you're an evaluator. You're sometimes, like, this program might be your baby or part of your organization's baby. And it's hard, right, to think about getting or hearing bad things, right? That a program isn't effective, that people don't like it. But that's why we do this work, right? So that we can improve our programs. Now, if negative or even positive feedback is totally off topic, right? If it's not central to what you are doing, feel free to redirect, right? You might want to create space for people to share that feedback elsewhere, so that they feel like they're being listened to. But never redirect because you just don't want to hear something bad about your program. Because ultimately the purpose here is to make your program the best it can be. And you can't do that if you don't know what the challenges are, what the opportunities for growth are. And I really want you to be knowledgeable about and pay attention to your own biases, right? So do you tend to pick on women more than men, or men more than women, or sort of think about those kinds of things and how they play a role then in, is it hard for you to hear negative feedback? You always want people to be positive, right? So you might cut people off, depending. You really, it just goes back to this, knowing yourself. Before you start your group, take some time to sort of recenter, review the topic guide or the question schedule just before the session, right? You really want to be familiar here with what you want to know. Really think about the arrangement of the room. Everybody should probably be able to see each other in the group, right, and engage with each other. When I have a note taker, actually ask them to sit with the group, because I think it can be very disconcerting if you have a group in a circle and your note taker's off in the corner behind people. Sometimes people don't like having somebody sit behind them. But again, it probably depends on your context, and you can sort of figure that out. But I really do think about that, right? Like if I have a small group, I like to have a smaller room and not a huge room. Just things, again, all of this depends on what your resources are, what you have available to you. But you want it to be a relatively unobtrusive way of taking notes, but again, like sort of thinking about these things. Always check your equipment before the session. I'm getting real logistical here, but always have extra batteries if you have an audio recorder or a camera, or if you need cables, and have them easily available, right? So that if there's a disruption, you can get back on track quickly as possible. I just snapped my fingers there. I don't know if you heard. Consider having at least water for participants if you can. And the session really should not be too long, but if it's longer, maybe plan a break accordingly. And also at the start, let people know they can leave to go to the restroom, tell them where it is, right? So that they're not feeling either like they're so distracted by whatever, immediate body need they have or whatnot, but also that they don't have to interrupt you to ask, like, where's the restroom? Where's the water? Whatever. So you start, and you sort of talked about this, right? What's the warm up? Have people go around and, tell each other their names. You might want to have name tents or name tags. I think this is actually especially helpful for transcribing later. Thank people for their time, right? Remember to be very welcoming here. You want to also tell them the purpose of the group. You want to think about the flow in advance. This is why piloting can be really helpful. If you only have half an hour and you need to get to your key questions quickly, you might not have as many transitional questions, and you want to move the group forward as necessary. You want to control your own reactions. You actually don't want to look too positive or too negative, but you don't want to be blank-faced either, right? This is why it's such an art form. It's fine to be empathetic. If you are particularly running a focus group about a difficult, challenging topic, there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that it's challenging, but what you don't want to do is have your responses kind of take over or inhibit, right? If people think you're getting too upset, that might inhibit what they share. Or if you're very, very positive to some people and very negative to others, right? You're giving the group messages about what you want to hear. Again, I'm going to return to this. Be comfortable with silences and pauses. It's okay to have some silence, not to let it go on forever, but probably longer than you might feel comfortable with. And people will sometimes fill those silences with really juicy, interesting stuff. It's okay to ask follow-up questions. That actually is one of the advantages. You don't have to stick to your script, so to speak. And I say right after the group, after people have left, it is so helpful to immediately write down any notes that you didn't write during the session, right? So just think about, did something occur to you? Did you have an insight? Did you actually think, oh, gee, we need to add this question to our question protocol? This will be very, very helpful to you both in sort of in the moment, but then later when you're analyzing the data. You might also want to debrief with your co-facilitator or note taker if that feels necessary, and that can be helpful to you too later when you're analyzing the data. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but these are some of the characteristics, I think, of effective moderators. I just want to really remind you of this last bullet point here, because it can be really hard. You want to think about refraining from terms that communicate judgment, right? So saying good or correct, those kinds of things kind of communicate, right, a sense of judgment. So just thinking about more neutral terms, or, saying, please tell me more, or, those kinds of things, as opposed to good or, oh, that's right, right? You never want to say, oh, right, sort of, even if you think that what they just said is correct or good or right. All right. You always need to have a plan in place for analyzing the data before you even start your project. Now, that doesn't mean that your plan might change, but you really want to think through some of these questions. Are you going to transcribe the groups? Are you going to, do transcription of every single group. That can be challenging. It takes time and resources. Or are you just going to listen to or watch the tape and conduct your analysis based on that? Will you take extensive notes, not record anything, and use that for analysis? I think that's really challenging. I strongly encourage you to record if you can, if resources allow. And I really discourage memory-based analysis. We have terrible memories. Our memories are informed by our biases. But if it's logistically impossible to record or take good notes, then or maybe it's a combination of notes and memory. I think that's really undesirable. But again, we don't always have control, right? There's sort of best practices, and then there's like getting the job done. So, we get that. You can actually analyze your focus group data in both qualitative and quantitative ways. You actually can count. You might count the number of times different topics emerge spontaneously, or themes emerge from your data. And more qualitative, I think, is what we associate with focus groups. And that's really a kind of summary, or you might explore a particular theme or topic. You might analyze it, provide some context around it too. Okay. Again, there will be lots of interesting things in your focus groups. I guarantee it, almost always. But your question determines everything. What did you seek? What do you need to know in order to make a decision, right? We talked about this, right? An evaluation is all about what information do you need to know in order to make a particular decision, and what is that decision, right? Oftentimes you're going to develop codes based on your data. That's pretty standard way of looking at qualitative data. There's sort of two ways to think about codes. Now I'm teaching you kind of research methods, but I think this is actually helpful. Inductive is when your codes kind of, I use this term, emerge. It's not passive, right? You're interpreting them, but it's really kind of based on, you read it and something interesting happens that you didn't expect or hadn't thought of, and you're like, oh wow, that's important. Again, that's important to making my decision, right? My question here. Deductive is when you go in, you have your codes already, and you're kind of looking at the data, looking for those codes, looking for that information, if you will. In real life, honestly, it's oftentimes a combination of inductive and deductive coding happens. Coding is iterative. You're going to be doing it sort of a couple of times. Oftentimes you develop your initial codes, and then your understanding of how they relate to each other might deepen. And then you do more focused coding. You might combine codes or themes. You might delete some. You might kind of amend others, say, I thought this was about, X, but really it's actually about X and Y. So coding is iterative. This analysis is kind of iterative. Honestly, focus group analysis can be quite challenging, especially if you're really going deep qualitatively. For your purposes, you may not be, depending again on what your question is. I went over this in the lecture on program evaluation, so I'm just going to kind of quickly talk about it here again. What your report looks like is really going to depend on who your report is intended for. Oftentimes it's helpful to get feedback on your report, to have like a go through where you, everyone looks through it. And it's always helpful to have recommendations, and then to get a plan on the books about how to act on those recommendations. And I say, it's always really helpful to sort of have this fourth major point here, to record your plan, and that you can kind of come back and look at like what you did, next time you do it, or next time the new program evaluator does it, right? So that you're not kind of reinventing the wheel. I have included here, and I'll give you the slides because I doubt it'll be long enough on the screen, a sample introductory statement for a group that sort of shows you how you can kind of orient a group. And what I really want to highlight here is you really want to normalize for the group that there might be disagreement, and that there's nothing wrong with that. And also normalize for them how you might be facilitating actively, right? So if someone's talking a lot, you might ask them to share a little less. If someone's not saying anything, you might ask them directly to respond to a question. And of course, they always, have the right to say they don't have anything to say about that. That's fine too. And here are some questions that I just actually found in a presentation on kind of the questions that come up when we're coding and analyzing qualitative data. And I thought those might be helpful for you too. Again, I'll make these available to you in slide format so that you have them. And I have some additional resources, and I should put me on there. Please, again, contact me if you have any questions as you're working through, and good luck. Focus groups are really fun to run, and I wish you the best of luck.